worship in spirit and truth. Those who say that they know him must walk as he walked. Those who worship the Lord worship in spirit and truth. Those who say that they know him must walk as he walked. He is the way and the truth, and in him is the life. If we obey his word, then we walk in the light. He is the way and the truth, and in him is the life. If we obey his word, then we walk in the light. If we say that we know him, but we don't keep his word, then we walk in the darkness, and the truth's not in us. If we walk in the light, we will have fellowship sweet, and the blood of Jesus will cleanse us from sin. He is the way and the truth, and in him is the life. If we obey his word, then we walk in the light. He is the way and the truth, and in him is the life. If we obey his word, then we walk in the light. He is the way and the truth, and in him is the life. If we obey his word, then we walk in the light. He is the way and the truth, and in him is the life. If we obey his word, then we walk in the light.
Well, good morning, friends. Good to be with everybody this morning. It is a snowy day outside. You can hear it. It's kind of an icy, snowy type of day out there. And so if you're living here in Maine, please do be careful if you're going to go anywhere. Please do. And just be very, very careful. As winter is back again today. So try to get all my final good mornings in here. And the last few that I'm seeing arrive. Thank you for your prayers yesterday. Yesterday was kind of a busy day. It was a brutal day. I did not feel good at all yesterday. Excuse me about that noise. But I'm up and at it again today. Good night of rest last night. A cup of coffee. We drink together. We are in the book of Ecclesiastes. Coming out of a trip to Fort Benning, Georgia, and serving Army families down there during the three days that I was there. And then traveling back up to Pennsylvania for my brother's funeral. Just a lot of time to reflect on life and the cycles of life and things that are latent in us as people, things that we see, family patterns, things of that nature. And that kind of threw me into the thoughts of Ecclesiastes. And so yesterday we covered chapter 1. Today we're in chapter 2 of the book of Ecclesiastes, working our way through. Now this book is a challenging book. It is challenging because it has tensions in it. It's challenging because you're thinking, if you're so wise, why do you do these things? But as a wise person, Solomon, did not just throw himself into the things that he did, but he stepped back from those things and said, what do I learn? What do I see? What do I experience? And so he applies himself to wisdom. It won't be until we get to the very end of this book that he makes his conclusion. So as we're reading this, I mean, it creates the tension saying, well, if Solomon did that, why can't I do that? Partly because we have something that Solomon did not have. We have the scriptures. Solomon had, at the best, the books written by Moses, the Pentateuch. We normally would call that the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. He had that, and perhaps some of the other historical writings, perhaps the writing about Job, he may have had that. Things written by Joshua, the record of the judges, perhaps Solomon had that much, but that was about it. The writings of his father that would not have been considered scripture at that point necessarily. The Psalms, he had that. We have the whole rest of the story. And Solomon did what Solomon did and wrote it down, and it got included in the text of Scripture for our benefit, that we would not make the same mistakes that Solomon made. Wisdom, in my estimation, wisdom is learning the lessons from the mistakes that others made, rather than going out and making those mistakes ourselves. I mean, I think that we can fairly say that would be considered wisdom. Getting into chapter 2 of this book. Sorry about the lip smacks. I've got a cough drop in the mouth as well at this hour, so apologize about that. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, he says, I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found that this too was meaningless. I'm using the New Living Translation as we work down through this. Be interesting to read this as well in the Message. He said, so I said, laughter is silly. What good does it do to seek pleasure? After much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people find during their brief life in this world. Excuse me. I also tried to find meaning by building huge homes for myself and planting beautiful vineyards. I made gardens and parks, filling them with all kinds of fruit trees. I built reservoirs to collect the water to irrigate my many flourishing groves. I bought slaves, both men and women, and others were born into my household, and I also owned large herds and flocks, more than any of the kings who had lived in Jerusalem before me. I collected great sums of silver and gold, the treasure of many kings and provinces. I hired wonderful singers, both men and women, and had many beautiful concubines. I had everything a man could desire. So I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me, and my wisdom never failed me. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for all my labors. But as I looked at everything I'd worked so hard to accomplish, it was all meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. I mean, it sounds so pessimistic, so fatalistic, so depressing almost to see the conclusion that he makes here about it all being meaningless. Now, again, going back to what I said yesterday, just the fact that just the fact that the pleasure, the meaningfulness comes as we connect these things to God, as we connect life to God, as we seek God. And he will conclude that in the 12th chapter. All these things, but there's God. And from youth to old age, to learn, to know, and to love God, and to embrace these things as gifts from God, to enjoy these things as gifts from God, that is the wisdom. And then learning from what we should abstain and to what we should give ourselves. There is nothing that can totally destroy life that we can experience, that we can do. Now, that's a rather large statement that I just made, and I know that it's a large statement that I just made. What ultimately destroys life is in not turning to God. What ultimately destroys life, and now there can be much harm done to other people. I don't want to say that there's not. I mean, you look at what he said about, all the concubines that he had, or you think about what he said about wine in this chapter as well. Again, I'm not a teetotaler. I'm not one who is opposed to drinking, but yet there are people who go and try to drink their sorrows away, and they find a pleasure. Now, I've experienced both types of people. I have watched people who go to the bars and come stumbling out full drunk. I've seen those people. I also have seen people, sat with people who will have an alcohol, a beverage of some variety, and experience deeply the things of the Lord and deep conversations of the Lord. And yet, in talking about those things, when there is not a governor, when I say a governor, I don't mean like Governor Mills. I mean a governor in life. When there's not the moderation applied to life, much harm can be done. Think of people who've lost loved ones to drunk drivers would be an example. Think of people who have had horrible family experiences because of alcohol in the home, or people who can't seem to make ends meet because they're drinking all their wages away. I mean, there is harm that is done and can be done when there is not a governor. Or you think about all the different women that he had, concubines. Now, we believe that Solomon had like 700 wives and concubines. It's a lot of women, That's like saying 2 women a day type of if you do the math out that way. Was there wisdom in that? Probably not. And he would point back at the end of this and say there was not wisdom in my pursuit of knowing and experiencing all things. And even some of us, as we read through this passage, where it said in verse 10, he said, I denied myself no pleasure. We think, well, okay, that's what Solomon did. That's a biblical thing to do, isn't it? I won't deny myself any pleasure. I'll just go right on out and do that. And I think some of us, in the way that we were brought up, perhaps, the way that we were taught, we have this fear of the pleasures of life that we don't need to have. What we need to have the fear of is the fear of God. What we need to have is the not the love of pleasure, but the love of God. And if we have the love of God, then the love of God will moderate us in our application of a life of pleasure. I hope this is making sense, what I'm seeking to try to say here. I mean, he had it all. And honestly, perhaps some of us, as we look at this passage, I'll put it back up there and read it again. I'll put it in the message this time as we think about it and think, it must be nice to have all that. I wish I had even a fraction of that. I mean, you might be a person in that boat thinking that way about this passage. Let me put it back up. Let's read this section in the message paraphrase again. I don't suggest that we utilize the message as a primary study tool, but I do suggest utilizing the message to help us gain nuanced insights into a passage or into a book like Ecclesiastes. Here it is. I said to myself, let's go for it. Experiment with pleasure and have a good time. But there was nothing to it, nothing but smoke. What do I think of the fun-filled life? Insane. Inane. My verdict on the pursuit of happiness is who needs it? With the help of a bottle of wine and all the wisdom I could muster, I tried my level best to penetrate the absurdity of life. I wanted to get a handle on anything useful we mortals might do during the years we spent on this earth. Oh, I did great things. I built houses, planted vineyards, designed gardens and parks, and planted a variety of fruit trees in them, made pools of water to irrigate the groves. I bought slaves, male and female, who had children, giving me even more slaves. Then I acquired large herds and flocks, larger than any before me in Jerusalem. I piled up silver and gold, loot from kings and kingdoms. I gathered a chorus of singers to entertain me with song. And most exquisite of all pleasures, voluptuous maidens for my bed. Now that is quite, I don't know what to say about that. Just, wow. Doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. Oh, how I prospered, verse 9. Oh, how I prospered. I left all my predecessors in Jerusalem far behind. Left them behind in the dust. What's more, I kept a clear head through it all. Everything I wanted, I took. I never said no to myself. I gave in to every impulse, held nothing back. I sucked the marrow of pleasure out of every task, my reward to myself for a hard day's work. Then I took a good look at everything I'd done, looked at all the sweat and hard work, but when I looked, I saw nothing but smoke. Smoke and a spitting into the wind. There was nothing to any of it, nothing. Do you ever feel that way? You look back and say, what have I really done? What have I really accomplished? I mean, to think about think about Solomon's buildings. They're no longer standing. You can see parts of what Solomon had built, but it's no longer there. You can see excavations that have taken place trying to find what was there. But again, it's gone. It's smoke. He will say all of that did not satisfy. He would say that alcohol didn't satisfy. He would say that gardening did not satisfy. He would say that entertainment did not satisfy. He would say that money did not satisfy. He would say that not holding back to any impulse, even that did not satisfy. And then work did not satisfy. When I looked, I saw nothing but smoke, smoke and spitting into the wind. There was nothing to any of it, nothing. Again, we could feel depressed. We could feel fatalistic. You might feel inclined to say, and I know some would be inclined to say this as they read the book of Ecclesiastes, well, if Solomon could go do that, why wouldn't I go do that? I'm not a wine person, so it doesn't appeal to me all that much. Honestly, now some of you might be wine people, or some of you might be heavy IPA type people. Perhaps IPA is a type of beer. You might be that type of person that could be your problem. That could be your Achilles heel. All the gardening. Some of you might have the green thumb, and how many people do we know that they build houses and they have gardens, they have all these things, and yet once they're no longer able to take care of those things, let's say that they have some type of illness or something that keeps them from the gardens, it's not long and those gardens are all overgrown, and those gardens turn from lusciousness to just a bunch of weeds. It doesn't take long. So the futility in that. Verse 7 talked about slavery, at least in the Message translation. I go back over to the New Living Translation. Verse 7 said, I bought slaves, both men and women. I mean, so even even the idea of slavery, and all the translations seem to be saying slavery. I mean, how do we feel about slavery? We are not people who are given to slavery in our day, especially as we think about American culture and all the trouble that we're still having because of slavery, even though that was 150 years ago or longer, and 160 years ago that we had slavery. No. Is that right? Yes. And we had slavery here in our country, and we would think that that's an awful thing, but yet in their day where they lived, they didn't think much of having slaves. Now, there were good slave masters and there were bad slave masters. The good ones took care of their slaves and cared for their slaves. Now, I'm not saying that I am pro-slavery, not by any stretch of the imagination. But yet, when you read the scriptures, when you understand the culture of the day, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, we do read about people who had slaves. Some people who would, in our day, would say, yeah, I'm a slave to my job too. Don't pay enough and don't take care of me good enough, but I have to go anyway. We might feel slavery in that way. And that is not even worth comparing with the heartache and the slavery of the whip to the back, and the shackles to the feet, and some of what our black brothers and sisters experienced in the days of American slavery. It pales in comparison. Yet around the world, throughout history, slavery has been an issue. Now there's other types of slavery in our day. There is sex slaves. There is sex slavery. There are sex slaves, and people that have given themselves right, maybe not given themselves, but have been maybe accosted, taken, stolen, kidnapped, and they end up being used as sex slaves. Again, slavery is something that we see in our day. Solomon talking about having slaves. He bought slaves, both men and women. Others were born in his household. He talked about all of his herds and all that he had. I look at verse 8, and I'm just giving you a little cue into my own life. I want to be honest with you. I look into verse 8, and I look at the sums of gold and silver and think, I wouldn't mind having that, but that has never been my forte. I've never been one that is apt at doing well at just making money and creating that's just not my gift area at all. And yet you think, wouldn't be bad to have more money. And then he talked about the singers, both men and women, and I mean, who doesn't enjoy some good entertainment? I do. I mean, some of you perhaps remember or can think of music groups that you listen to for entertainment. I have a very good friend who every day has like a song of the day from some famous group. And the meaningfulness also of entertainment. He calls all things meaningless, but there is the meaningfulness that some of us give ourselves over to wonderful singers, both men and women. Regardless of what genre of music you may like. You might like country music. You might like classic rock music. You might like only Christian music. But when we hear really good music, it's something that can lift the soul. There is something beneficial about that. But then he also says in verse 8, he says down here, he says, and I had many beautiful concubines. And the way that the message put that, I mean, how does that strike you? The most exquisite of all pleasures, voluptuous maidens for my bed. I mean, how does reading that strike you? And I'm not necessarily asking for you to comment unless you want to comment. But again, doesn't leave much to the imagination in the way that is penned. That could be an area. I look at some of my family familial background on my mom's side of the family, and at least one of my uncles, was just a womanizer, and that could be a tempting area for me. I don't think alcohol would be the area. I don't think gardening would be the area. That would be an area of temptation for me. And now you might say, is it wise for the pastor to say something like that? Well, friends, I think we need to be able to acknowledge where our Achilles heel might be. I think we need to be able to acknowledge where we struggle. And too many times we gloss over, we cover over, we pretend that we're all righteous and all of that. And yet, truth be told, we all have our areas of temptation. We all have our areas of struggle. And certainly Solomon has laid out many of the things that those could be for us. It could be having the degree. It could be having the job title of some variety that you think gives you meaningfulness in life. But yet Solomon comes back down and says it's all nothing more than smoke and spitting into the wind. Well, let's continue on down through this passage. Let me get back over to the New Living Translation, and we will go a little bit further with this. He calls but this section has the heading, "The Vanity of Living Wisely." He said, "So I decided to compare wisdom with foolishness and madness. For who can do this better than I, the king?" Now, you talk about humility. There's not a lot of humility in that statement, is there? "I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. For the wise can see where they're going, but fools walk in the dark. Yet I saw that the wise and foolish share the same fate. Both will die. So I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value of all my wisdom? This is all so meaningless. For the wise and the foolish both die. The wise will not be remembered any longer than the fool. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. So I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun is so troubling. Everything is meaningless, like chasing the wind." Now, again, I understand that this may not be inspirational reading that we're doing here this morning. But when we look at our lives and we look at how we live and we look at the things in life that we do, sometimes we really begin to ponder, and we may have some of the same conclusion as does Solomon. What's the value of my wisdom? And we could say, well, if that's the way it is, then let's go out and be drunken, sex-crazed fools. But yet Solomon says, there's the fools who walk in the dark, and me as a wise man, I walk in the light. He did the things he did with his eyes open. He did the things that he did to say, now what do I learn from this? And what do I step back from? And what do I no longer do? And what lessons are there to learn? The fool would never do that. The fool would just keep on living in that type of a way and would suffer the consequences of the type of life that the fool would live. Give me some response. How is all this hitting you so far as we work our way through this? In a little bit of my research at looking for other people who have taken a stab at teaching through Ecclesiastes, a lot of them have boiled it down into like one message. This is what it says in a nutshell. And yet there are 12 chapters here, and to me it just makes sense to work our way through all 12 chapters and to think about what it has to say. Verse 17 said, I came to hate life because everything I'd done here is so troubling. Do you ever feel that? Some, if we're honest, we feel that way. And one of our listeners is going through some illness right now and can't work and is set back financially because they're an hourly worker. And so they have a little setback because of that, and they're somebody that keeps trying to get ahead of things, and then there's a setback. And so life becomes troubling and difficult. And by the way, that is a cue that if you wanted to give anything extra into the benevolence fund, you could certainly do that. I personally have invested myself in trying to meet some needs for the individual, but they'll have other needs, and it's good to take care of other people. So I encourage us to think about people that are going through and feeling the weightiness of life. I know among our listeners, there are some that say, yep, life is hard. Life is troubling. And I would say to you that we have to choose what perspective we're going to have on life. Are we going to have a fatalistic perspective? Are we going to have a pessimistic perspective? Or are we going to say, okay, I understand everything for what it really is, but I'm optimistic because of God. God gives me the ability to be optimistic. God gives me the ability to be positive because I will look to him and he will work all things together. There'll be a verse that will come across here that says that God makes all things beautiful in its time. So for us to remember that God does make all things beautiful in his time. Friend said this, great lessons, perhaps difficult to hear, but important for us and relevant to us all. Absolutely. Thanks, Fran. Appreciate those words. Let me continue on down through this chapter, verses 18 through 26. We'll go back into those. It says, I came to hate all my hard work here on earth. Yes, how many of us would feel that every day? You leave work and it's like, I hate my work. No, I don't hate my work, actually. What I hate is there's too much of it, and I'm having to make choices of where I'm going to focus myself. And I think teaching is where I need to be focusing myself and giving myself to that. But I came to hate all my hard work here on earth, for I must leave to others everything I have earned. Now, just thinking about what that is saying, you're talking about inheritance. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they will control everything I have gained by my skill and hard work under the sun. How meaningless. So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work in this world. Some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. This too is meaningless, a great tragedy. So what do people get in this life for all their hard work and anxiety? Their days of labor are filled with pain and grief. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. It is all meaningless. So I decided there's nothing better than to enjoy food and drink and to find satisfaction in work. Then I realized that these pleasures are from the hand of God. For who can eat and enjoy anything apart from him? God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please him. But if a sinner becomes wealthy, God takes the wealth away and gives it to those who please him. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Just looking at what this is talking about, and probably most of us, if not all of us, could think of situations where people worked hard their whole life. They built a business, they built a farm, they built some wealth. And yet it doesn't take very long, within one generation, and it's all parsed out. It's all divided up. It's all broken up. It's no longer the empire that it once was. It's no longer the property that it once was. It's no longer, and I know those things from firsthand experience. Our family farm has been all chunked up, and I know that is true. And so when people leave things, they don't know. They don't know what will happen. They don't know what people will do with their inheritance. And often this is the case. Have you not witnessed this very thing that Solomon is saying here, that we see people take all the hard work that the previous generation invested themselves in and squandered it away? It happens. So he says, I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work. But then it says in verse 21, some people work wisely with skill and knowledge then they leave it to somebody who hasn't worked for it. So verse 24 gives us a great conclusion here. So I decided there is nothing better than to enjoy food and drink and to find satisfaction in work. Then I realized that these pleasures are from the hand of God. Notice food, a pleasure from God. Drink, a pleasure from God. Work, a pleasure from God. To think about work as a pleasure, to think of work as a blessing, to think of work as a benefit that God has given to us. He goes on in verse 25 and says, for who can eat or enjoy anything apart from God? God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please him. And so for us to make the choice, I want to have wisdom, I want to have knowledge, I want to have joy. And how do we get those things? How do we gain wisdom? How do we gain knowledge? How do we gain joy? It's in living for Christ. That is how we gain those things. God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who live to please him. Can I suggest to you that living to please God is not just a case of whether you look good to those around you in terms of your moral compass, but it goes deeper than that. It goes deeper into abiding in him. It goes deeper into walking with him. It goes deeper than that. It goes into experiencing God and seeking to encounter God and seeking to hear God's voice through his word and by his spirit. And that is the place that we need to come to in our lives. I mean, I've known lots of Christians that have applied themselves to their morality and yet would tell you it's all been folly and vanity and dissatisfaction because they necessarily weren't living to please God. They were just living to not look dirty. And but to live to please God is God, how do I glorify you in my work? Or God, how do I glorify you in and through my life? I mean, that is the question that we look at and that we struggle with and that we want to live for is, God, how do I glorify you? And sometimes just living a life where, I'm not a drunk, so I'm okay. But you can not be a drunk and still not please God. You can be a person who's not a womanizer or a manizer, go the other way, and still not please God. You can be a person who goes to church every week and still not please God, because God's pleasure is found in our delight in him. God's pleasure, pleasing him, using that word that was at the end in verse 26 of chapter 2, he gives joy to those who please him. God's pleasure is as we delight in him. And for us to learn to delight in him and worship, to delight in him and sitting before him and waiting before him. And God will do so much more when we learn how to do that. So often we give ourselves to our pleasures, or we even give ourselves to our work and to our career, and we do so without God. But Solomon's conclusion to the matter is that even satisfaction in work is a pleasure from God. And so to work with God's pleasure, to work for God's pleasure, to work with God in our day. Well, Walter has a comment, and Priscilla has a comment here that they've shared. Like Solomon, it's good to reflect at times on where our life is going and should we change direction or continue our present course? Absolutely. Priscilla says, I've always been an optimist, even through very difficult times. The Lord was working in my life long before I accepted him as Savior, a humbling and inspiring thought, and I've been rewarded with much joy. Well, I mean, that's a great way to land this morning, to think about the joy that we can have in knowing God, in walking with God, in allowing God to work in our lives, as well as thinking about what Walter says. Do you need to make a course correction? Does something need to change in your life? I hope that you would consider that. If there's a direction shift that you need to make, I mean, that is a reasonable question for us to ask ourselves along the way. Do I need to change direction? So anyway, I want to just encourage you today with what we've read. Lori's coming late, and I'm leaving a little early this morning because we've worked our way through chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. And it's given me joy to be here with you today. I've been delighted to be with you here today. This weekend, we will be having quite a conversation that should stimulate thought. We're talking about the roles of men and women. It comes out of our study of the book of Joshua. There are a couple of places in the study that highlight some of the bold askings of women. Excuse me. And we need to, I just want to draw from that, and that set me on a course of helping us to try to understand the uniquenesses of men and women and the beauty that there is in that there is male and female, and what roles has God called us to, and what does that look like in the family? What does that look like in the church? And so I think it will be things that there's a lot of information there that will cause a lot of thought, I'm sure. A friend says, I pray many times throughout the day, asking him to guide me, use me meaningfully, and keep me focused rightfully, not to make mistakes in all ways during my work day. I love my work, and earning the greatest pay never joys me more than fulfilling the most needy for a home, truly. So to find joy. My prayer is that today you would have joy in your work as you do your work today. Lord, I want to lift my friends to you today as they go about their work, as we go about eating and drinking, whether it's toast and coffee or eggs or whatever we might eat or drink today, that we would have joy. As Solomon said, I decided there's nothing better than to enjoy food and drink and to find satisfaction in work. And I realize that these pleasures are from the hand of God. That, Lord, help us to live for your pleasure. Help us to live in your pleasure today, that we might rightly glorify you by delighting in you, the God of all the universe. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, friends, that's a wrap for today. I will see you over the weekend. Have a great day, everyone.